So good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for being here today and participating in our webinar, Strategies to Lead and Influence Change. We have a great lineup of speakers, and I'm really excited to be able to introduce them and hear from them today. So my name is Melanie. I am the Manager of Communications and Network Engagement here at the Ontario Nonprofit Network. If you're new to ONN, welcome. We're so happy to have you here today. We're a provincial network that focuses on public policy, advocacy, and providing services to strengthen Ontario's nonprofit sector. And if you're already a member, thank you so much for making our advocacy work possible. So while we're waiting for a few more folks to join, I have one more poll for you guys today, which is about what you're interested in learning from this webinar. So what are you looking forward to learning in today's webinar? Are you interested in getting tactics and strategies to help your organization advance its advocacy efforts and influence public policy? Are you interested in discussing how to inspire change? Are you hoping to discover and hear examples of how sector leaders have adapted to lead positive change during the pandemic? Or are you also really excited to participate in our live Q&A where you can ask questions to the speakers themselves? So I'll just leave that open for a quick moment. And while we have that poll open, actually, maybe I'll go through a couple housekeeping notes. So if you experience any technical difficulties during the webinar, such as a visual lag, we recommend you closing your browser and reopening it. If you still experience any problems, please feel free to type them into the chat box. And if you have any questions for our amazing panelists today, please feel free to type them into the question box. We'll try to get to as many questions as possible during our live Q&A. And to answer our most common question asked, you will receive an email with the recording and slides within 1 week of this webinar. So let's see what we have from the poll. Great, so it seems like a bit of a mix. People are really excited to learn strategies to advance advocacy efforts and also to learn how they can inspire change. So these are all things that we're going to be covering today. But before we do, I would like to have a land acknowledgement. So before we get into the conversation, I would like to acknowledge that at ONN, we're working on the traditional lands of the Huron-Wendat, Haudenosaunee, and the Mississaugas of the New Credit. This territory is part of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt and the Upper Canada Treaties. I'm also joining you from the traditional lands of the Huron-Wendat, Haudenosaunee, and the Mississaugas of the Credit as well today. And at ONN, we believe that as nonprofits, we must take seriously our role in responding to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's call to action. As settlers, we are grateful for the opportunity to live and work on this territory. And as individuals, we all have an obligation to learn from the Indigenous communities about collective ownership and sustainable economic and environmental systems that are respectful of the land and the water which we depend on. So please feel free to share what territory and land that you are coming from in the chat box today as well, as we know that everyone is coming from different parts of the province. So to set the context for today's webinar, we're going to be hearing from 3 incredible speakers. Our first speaker today is Angela Carter. And so Angela Carter is the Executive Director of Roots Community Services. Angela is a well-rounded intercultural communicator and sector leader with over 30 years of experience. She's experienced in the field of communications, including journalism, internal and external communications, public relations, marketing, and cultural diversity. From strategic planning to intercultural diversity and inclusion consulting, board governance, and leadership planning, Angela is very experienced leading change, to say the least. Angela advocates for the upliftment of Black, African, and Caribbean communities. She works tirelessly to break down systemic and other barriers that continue to negatively impact members of these communities. She currently co-chairs a regional committee on anti-Black racism and systemic discrimination in Peel Region. Thank you, Angela, for your advocacy efforts and for taking the time to share your expertise and experience with us today. Over to you, Angela. So Angela, we can't quite hear you, so I'm just gonna try, we're just gonna try again. No, we're not quite able to hear you, so maybe we'll try unmuting and try that again. We're not able to hear you now. So what we'll do is I'll work with you on your audio, and maybe what we'll do is we'll have Anjum, Sultana speak while we work on that, if that's okay for everyone. So while Angela will be speaking, but we're just going to mix it up a little bit and have her as our second speaker today. So instead, we're first going to have Anjum Sultana speak, which I'm really excited to introduce Anjum because I actually met Anjum a couple years back, and I find that she is so involved in so many different aspects of our nonprofit sector. Anjum Sultana is the National Director of Public Policy and Strategic Communications at YWCA Canada, the country's largest and oldest gender equity organization. The YWCA Federation has 32 member associations and works in 300 communities across Canada. Together, they reach over 330,000 people every year. Anjum is the primary author and operations lead for a feminist economic recovery plan, Making the Economy Work for Everyone, the first nationally focused recovery plan of its kind. She's a frequently cited expert, and her commentary can be found on platforms such as CBC, City TV, and CTV. I'm extremely grateful to have met Anjum last year and see her leadership and advocacy work in action. She's a dedicated leader, and we're very excited to have her here today. Over to you, Anjum.
Thank you so much for your kind words, Melanie, and it's been such a pleasure seeing your journey and your incredible work. So thank you again for the invite. And I'm really thrilled to be here on this panel with Angela and Teshini, who I've read about your work or I've seen it firsthand. So really excited to be here today. So what I wanted to talk about, and I don't know if my slide deck will come up soon, but while it's coming up, is on some of the work we've been doing on a feminist economic recovery plan for Canada. So this is something, you know, when we started 2020, we didn't really think that this would be something we would be thinking about, any of us, right? How to deal with the immediate impacts of this crisis, but also looking at how can we use this particular opportunity to create a better, more inclusive society for us all? But that's what we did in the midst of this pandemic, and I'm excited to share some of our learnings and hope that it could be of value to the people listening today. So Melanie in my introduction talked a bit about the work that we do, but really when I think about ONN, the leadership work is done around networked advocacy. I think in terms of some of the impacts we've had with our advocacy work during this pandemic, that has been at the core. And it's because of our dual work at the YWCA Canada Federation of national advocacy and community action. This year is actually our 150th anniversary, and it's not the first pandemic we've gone through as a federation. But what we really see as its importance is how we can drive those insights that we see on the ground through service delivery to inform that systemic change at the federal level and other orders of government as needed. And so what I want to take us next to is about the feminist economic recovery plan. So if we can go to the next slide. This is something that we did in partnership with the Institute for Gender and the Economy at the University of Toronto. And this is a plan that had come out of what we saw on the ground. So as soon as March 11th happened, when the World Health Organization called COVID-19 a pandemic, our CEOs and EDs from across the country were meeting on a weekly basis to understand and figure out and problem solve around addressing the concerns. But we also saw that there was this opportunity not only to do that short-term thinking, but that long-term thinking about recovery. And so this is the culmination of those conversations, those discussions, as well as the environmental scan and policy recommendations we put together. And what I'm really proud to say is that from tip to tail, from the conceptualization of this project to the writing to the design, it was all done by young women of color. And you'll see in our plan, one of the things that we talk a lot about is diverse voices in decision making, but also diversity in suppliers. So we're really glad that this entire project, we were able to fulfill some of that in the way we did this work too. So if we go to the next slide, this will kind of outline the 8 pillars and 27 recommendations. I won't go into detail here because you can see it in greater depth at www.feministrecovery.ca, where we have it in English and French. But I think what we wanted to really highlight in this plan was being authentic to the work that we do on the ground. So it was very much grounded in our work that we do as a YWCA movement around housing and shelter services, employment and training programs, childcare, addressing gender-based violence and supporting survivors of gender-based violence. That was all throughout our plan, but also thinking about the people that we serve. So ensuring that we talk about the need to address systemic racism, that we talk about the importance of diversity in decision making. That's something that we wanted to make sure our plan talked about at length, because we see that as fundamental to any conversation about economic recovery. In terms of how did we do this work? So this plan was launched on July 28th. So if we go to the next slide. We had multiple things that we were doing to ensure that this information was getting out to as wide an audience as possible. So it started off with our partnership. We were very strategic in working with an academic institution because we knew we had that expertise from civil society, and we have done research and policy, but there's something different that we can bring to the table coming together. And that, in fact, we believe opened up a lot of doors to see this recommendation viewed in different light, especially working with an organization that has a focus on the economy and economics. We also did this through our expert reviewers. So we had people from across our movement review this document at length, but also external reviewers, academics, policy analysts. And that also helped to ensure that this information wasn't just staying with the YWCA community. It was something that was seen as something everyone could see themselves in, hopefully, or at least a starting point. We also put this out to all parliamentarians, so sending a copy of this, the e-copy, to all members of parliament and senators, just to make sure everyone was able to see our recommendations. But where we also did a lot of work was around media relations. And I really want to highlight this in terms of influencing change. Definitely the decision makers who are, looking at these recommendations that come before them, that's a very important group to engage, but also the public, because we know public pressure matters. It pushes conversations forward. And so we were glad to be part of the organizations really talking about a gendered impact of this crisis, but not only talking about the problems or the concerns, but also coming forward with solutions. And finally, an area that we're in the midst of doing more work on is engaging business and labor, because we see that this pandemic, we need all parts of society to come to the table and think about a feminist recovery. So that's some of the work that we've been doing currently with local chambers of commerce and other business entities, as well as labor councils. So we could go to the next slide. And so, on July 28th, we put forward this plan. 3 months later, today is our 3-month anniversary. We've seen a lot of uptake. In the September 23rd throne speech, we actually saw mentions of our plan in that throne speech. So, the push for a feminist and intersectional response to this pandemic and recovery. We're one of the few organizations that were really pushing that feminist recovery. So we're really glad to see that was reflected. We also talked a lot about the need for tables that would engage our sector and women and two-spirit and gender diverse people in conversations about economic recovery. So now we see that there's some form of that, an action plan for women in the economy. And of course, the care economy is essential to recovery, and we are one of the largest nonprofit providers of childcare. So we're glad to see that childcare was on the agenda. And if we go to the next slide, I can share a bit about where we want to see continued action. And some lessons learned. So we were able to see within a 3-month period, and in fact a 2-month period, many of our messages reflected in government policy documents. And I think part of it was leveraging the policy window. A door has been opened. So all of you that are working on the different issues, there's more of an appetite now than ever before. From my experience and talking to colleagues in the sector, because we are in a crisis mode. So people who come forward with solutions, organizations that come forward with solutions are going to be seen in a light where, okay, how can we work together to build back better? I think also an important lesson learned was creating space for your advocacy. So thinking about, for example, we talked a lot about the gendered impacts of this crisis. So we were seeing that on the ground, but we wanted to make sure that this was something everyone was talking about. So doing our part to get the message out there. Something else that we've started to do more work on recently is talking about this task force for the action plan on women in the economy. Who's going to sit on that task force? We want to see that diversity, and we want to see that intersectional representation. One group we want to make sure is not left out is young people, young women and non-binary youth. And so what we've started to do is to start to push that messaging out in the public. And when you have that in the public sphere, it creates the space for your advocacy. So that's one of the lessons we've learned through this process. And finally, tapping into your network. A big lesson learned for us is, people are very passionate about pushing forward issues, and they can see that themselves represented in it as well. So how do we work together to all amplify the same messaging? So what we did with the Feminist Economic Recovery Plan, we saw that, as a humble contribution and a starting point, and we were encouraging others in our network, other organizations, other YWCAs, people across the country, to take a look and see how that applies to your local context and push forward that work. And so we're glad to see from coast to coast to coast people talking about this issue. I'll stop here, but I'm really looking forward to the discussion and conversation ahead.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Anjum. That was so much information, and I've reviewed the report, and it's so incredible to be able to hear your view on the process and everything you did. Now, I would love I do see that there's some questions, but what I'll do is I'll save the questions for you, Anjum, during our question and answer period. And in the meantime, we would love to hear from Angela Carter. So I'm just going to go back a few slides. And so our first speaker was Angela Carter, the Executive Director of Roots Community Services, Inc. And I'm just going to make sure, Angela, that we're able to hear you and everything's going well on your end.
Hi, good afternoon. Can you hear me this time?
Yes, thank you so much.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Thank you, Melanie, and to the Ontario Nonprofit Network for this opportunity. And well, we know with all these glitches now with technology, we get used to these things, right? So thank you. The true test of leadership is how you function in a crisis. And the purpose of influence is to speak for those who have no influence. Those two quotes are from international training consultant Brian Tracy and author and Pastor Rick Warren, respectively. So how do you lead and influence change, especially in the time of crisis, and especially when you don't actually have hold power? So it is difficult, it is stressful, it can be devastating and humbling. But it also heightens your passion, right? It makes you determined, it gives you grit, it opens the doors through which your creativity, courage, and commitment flows, and it takes time. As Melanie stated in the introduction, I'm the Executive Director of Roots Community Services, and we are a grassroots multi-service charitable organization that offers programs and services focused on the Black, African, and Caribbean communities in the region of Peel and recently in Halton region in the Greater Toronto area. Our organization, I'm going to talk a bit about our organization and how we managed to be able to be able to get to the table to help effect change. So our organization, formerly United Achievers Community Services, was established more than 30 years ago in the city of Brampton. And I actually volunteered with the organization back in the 90s and the early 2000s. But when I took over the executive position 5 years ago, the organization was facing tough times and a bleak future, which had caused the funders to be very jittery. So I wasn't fully aware of the challenges I had faced when I joined, but I knew that being only one of a few Black-led, Black-focused organizations in the region, it couldn't fail. So I stepped in, and because there was a need. There's a substantial Black population in this region. There's over 131,000 people that require a culturally sensitive and understanding agency to address their needs and to advocate on their behalf. It was an uphill battle, and at times I felt like giving up. But when I considered how the staff were pouring their hearts into delivering services within the community and heard about and saw the positive impacts they were making on the lives of individuals and families, I just couldn't leave. I felt compelled that I had to lead the change that was necessary for the survival of the agency. So one of the strategies you need to be able to lead and influence change is to be committed to drive the change needed. You have to be committed to make tough decisions, to be resolute, to be risk-attuned, not risk-averse. You must be ready to stand alone for a while as you convince others about the vision you have and the path that needs to be taken. You also have to be bold, be determined, and take decisive action when necessary. I took some bold steps in rebuilding the agency, which led to it now being considered a strong voice in the community and the leading organization that serves the Black, African, and Caribbean communities in our region. I took the bold step of bringing funders together to ask them what do they like about us and what would they like to see change, and how would they walk alongside us to be able to make the changes necessary to be able to be sustainable. And I couldn't do it alone. To be where we are today, it took years of collaboration and cultivation. While you may sometimes stand alone when you envision a concept, you need to work with others to implement and accomplish the task. In rebuilding our organization, I ensured that we fostered relationships with our funders, other community agencies, public officials, systems leaders, and key stakeholders in the community, including our clients. I also ensured that we continue to deliver quality service. I was transparent with the staff each step of the way, letting them know when we had setbacks and when we were able to leap forward. I sought their input in decisions and removed a lot of the restrictions under which they were working. Through cultivating and encouraging them, they became great ambassadors for the organization. I was also transparent with our funders, keeping them informed on our progress or lack thereof as we work through our challenges. And this was very important because if they had deadlines and timelines to meet, I was able to talk to them and said, why I am not able to meet those timelines, what were the issues, and I kept them apprised of what was happening. Communicating is another key strategy, especially active listening. We listen to our stakeholders, our clients, the funders, the donors, the volunteers. And I encourage you, and I responded by becoming actively involved in the issues, advocating on behalf of the communities we served, and adapting our services and programs to meet their needs. We added new programs and tripled our staff complement in 5 years. Over time, the opinions change about our organizations, and we are being sought after by others who want to collaborate with us, or to hear our views on concerns affecting not only the Black, African, and Caribbean communities, but on citywide and region-wide issues. With the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic, which was followed by the anti-Black racism uprising after George Floyd's murder, we have been actively involved at community tables, discussing the effects on residents and seeking solutions to mitigate the negative consequences. The region of Peel formed a community roundtable, which we joined, and out of that was formed the Anti-Black Racism and Systemic Discrimination Committee, which I co-chair. And this collective, which comprises a cross-section of community organizations, is challenging institutions such as the police and healthcare and education to remove discriminatory policies, processes, and practices from their operations. Through our advocacy, we will be meeting with the Peel Regional Police to discuss the measures they're putting in place to address these issues, how our committee can support what they're doing, and how we will hold them accountable to ensure they do what they say they will be doing. We also sit on an advisory committee that is holding the Public School Board accountable for its actions regarding systemic discrimination. Actually, through the work we do on this committee and the pressures from parents and other community advocates, the Ministry of Education conducted a review of the board last fall and found that there is systemic anti-Black racism within the board. This led to the removal of the Director of Education and a start to dismantling of the systemic barriers. Our organization has expanded into the neighboring region, and there are agencies seeking to partner with us so we can provide culturally relevant and culturally safe programs to their clients from the Black community. So I encourage you to be passionate and to be humble. Do not be afraid to show or speak about your passion. It is what drives you and keeps you moving forward against the odds. Show humility when engaging with others, especially if you hold the power in the relationship. Listen to the other person. Ask for their suggestions. Recognize their strengths and apologize if you make a mistake. Also, you need to think critically, be forward-looking and agile-minded. You want to be able to assess a situation critically, but also to anticipate what is coming and be in a position to mobilize your stakeholders and make decisions quickly. We were able to switch relatively easy to work remotely at the start of the COVID pandemic when we all went into lockdown, because as an organization, we saw trends pointing to a changing workplace. Within the last 2 years, we equipped most of our staff with laptops. Actually, there were only 2 that needed to get laptops when we went into lockdown. We contracted an IT company to manage our servers and backup systems. And we were in the process of changing our telephone system to a voice over IP system. This allowed us to be able to answer our business phones over a computer, tablet, or cell phone, no matter where we were. So these changes enabled us to have an almost seamless switch to virtual service delivery, which was great, especially for our seniors population. We have a very large seniors population, and they met very frequently, weekly actually, in a number of their programs. And we were able to switch and offer them online service 5 days a week, which was able to reduce the isolation that many seniors face. I encourage you to continue to learn and stretch your imagination. Be self-reflective and assess how you interact with others, especially during a time like what we're experiencing right now. You need compassion and empathy, as well as much as creativity and innovation. As author and Pastor John C. Maxwell said, a leader is one who knows the way, goes the way, and shows the way. And to borrow from Nelson Mandela, if you really want to change the world, let the women lead. I look forward to answering any of the questions you have, and thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Angela. And thank you everyone for listening and writing in your questions. We will ask Angela your questions in the Q&A session. But before that, I'm really excited to introduce Teshini, my coworker, who has a really cool tool to share with you guys. So Teshini has several years of experience in government relations, policy analysis, research, nonprofit policy advocacy, project management, communications, and event management. You've probably read a lot of Teshini's work through our e-news. Teshini is our policy analyst here at ONN, and whether it's analyzing our sector survey results or submitting our latest pre-budget submission, Teshini is busy behind the scenes advancing the advocacy efforts of our sector. We're so lucky to have her on our team and also on our webinar today. So thank you so much, Teshini.
Thank you, Anjum, and really happy to be here. Thank you, Angela and Anjum, for your presentations. I think they're really key here and very important, and I think they speak to a lot of what we've been seeing during the COVID period in terms of advocacy and action from nonprofits at different levels in local communities, and the need to kind of be collaborative, nimble, flexible, and working, you know, across different spaces, different sectors, and different networks to kind of drive things forward. Given that we have this big window of opportunity that Anjum has spoken to. So just a little bit on ONN if you're not familiar, but I think I would assume most people are familiar. So we work with 58,000, work with and for 58,000 nonprofits across the province to ensure that they have, you know, a really good environment to do their advocacy work and to continue doing the good work that they do to support their communities. So we really want a thriving nonprofit sector. So we engage mostly with the provincial government, but we do work with different partners at different levels as needed and try to support. So for example, on the issue of childcare that impacts women, given the fact that the nonprofit sector is a women majority sector, about 80% of the workforce is women. And so we've been working with YWCA, with different organizations to kind of address those matters such as childcare, whether it be federally or provincially. So just a brief on that, just to kind of connect the dots on what's happening. So the tool I have, if you don't mind, Melanie, moving to the next slide. Sorry, I'll slow down for you. So I think what Angela and Anjum spoke to was what's kind of laid out in our advocacy spectrum that we presented last year at our conference, and now we'll be sharing it more broadly soon. So there's different types of activities that a nonprofit organization can engage in on the ground level, as well as in terms of engaging with government to kind of activate their advocacy or engage or move around. So you could choose from writing letters, or as Anjum pointed to, writing a collaborative piece, so the Feminist Recovery Plan, working with networks. Angela also pointed to working and engaging with government and the board around issues around anti-Black racism. So there are lots of different activities along that spectrum that nonprofits can participate in. And I think Angela and Anjum pointed to that in the work that they do at their organization, and along with what we do here at ONN. So next slide, please. Sorry. Yeah, so the purpose of the spectrum overall is just to outline these activities and recognize that no one action is sufficient on its own. You're going to need a bunch of different actions at different times. There are different moments of opportunity available to you, and you as an organization can choose which opportunity is best for you. From, you know, writing an op-ed, like Anjum said, doing some media work, or just working collaboratively on, you know, doing a convening to kind of, you know, pass on and share information and help kind of influence policy as you go along. And also recognizing that no one option is better than the other. There are moments, like I said, of opportunity that you can use different options or different actions to drive policy forward. And again, this is not linear. We're all moving around in different spaces. Given COVID, particularly, things have not been linear. We're reacting. We're trying to address things, and, you know, the windows of opportunity are open, so acting at those points. So you could use whatever you need at the time you need and for whatever works for your organization. And so ultimately, it's just more like this is a menu of items that you can choose to use, or tactics that you can choose to use to engage, work with others, collaborate, and make sure you're engaging with government to address the issues that your communities are facing. Next slide, please. So I think one of the key advantages of looking at, you know, advocacy across the spectrum is that you can start thinking about how other organizations are engaging on similar issues, you know, sitting down with them, talking with them, figuring that out, identify the gaps and maybe points of alignment and convergence that exist between you and other organizations, and how you can work together more concretely to push certain things. You may not always agree on everything, but there are different acts that you can take on, whatever fits within your organization's capacity and mission. I think that's the most important thing to remember. Also, it just shows you like how you can engage individually as well as organizationally. So as an individual, it could be sharing a social media post, or, you know, what we've seen working with our network is we put out, say, for example, during COVID, that the nonprofit sector needs a sector stabilization fund at the provincial level. And so we've been asking our members and our networks to reiterate those messages in the advocacy work they're doing. So that shows up consistently when government is engaging with them. And so you see that there's collaboration across the board, and the government, you're signaling to the government that these nonprofits, this community is very much needs this, and so hopefully that moves the dial forward on that action. So there are different ways of doing it. So I'm just going to speak to kind of what ONN's been doing broadly during COVID-19, and then speak to a specific example that actually happened this month. So thank you, Melanie. So COVID-19 happened. We all went into lockdown in Ontario on March 13th. And for ONN, it was immediate react, drop, making sure our staff, like Angela said, has everything they need to work remotely, responding to the needs of the sector in terms of providing webinars and different supports to be able to support them to address that. On the advocacy side of things, the first was writing a letter to government asking for some key concrete items around a stabilization fund, for example, and kind of continuing that on. Then we did a flash survey because we were realizing that we don't have all this information of what's happening on the ground. We know closures may be imminent because we're hearing things from different parts of the network. And so we decided to put a flash survey out, about 10 questions, just to get a temperature on what's actually happening and how we as ONN can better support the network and also advocate with the network to push government to address the issues that nonprofits are facing. And so from that sector survey, we found a lot of really key information about the possibility of closures. Some nonprofits were closing already. We saw, particularly in the childcare space, that was very much there was a big impact there. And so we used that information along with obviously talking with our networks, particularly our provincial associations, and working with them, because we started meeting with them weekly instead of every few months like we would normally do, to get an idea of what's happening on the ground. And that helped inform our sector stabilization fund proposal and plan that we had, and the number that we gave government. And from then on, we pushed on and decided, okay, given the supports that had been announced both federally and the different supports that had been announced provincially, is the nonprofit sector getting access to these supports? What's been happening in the last 6 months? Have things changed? How have they changed? And what do we as ONN need to know to be able to, again, move things forward? So we did a second COVID sector survey, and we worked with the Assemblée francophone de l'Ontario, so the AFO, to do that and to get an idea of what's happening in terms of francophone organizations, and more broadly what's happening across the sector. And so that was really helpful in us grounding that out and getting an idea of what the sector has access to. And so what we found is that a lot of the supports that were allocated federally and provincially, the sector did not have access to, or some of the supports that were announced, for example, like pandemic pay, were slowly coming in. So we could actually address and push government on particular things like moving those things forward faster, or again, pushing for that sector stabilization fund. And lastly, our pre-budget submission, we sent out, I assume and I hope everyone did get an opportunity to send out their pre-budget submissions this year. I think it's really crucial that we do. And so we reiterated the same ask. We didn't start with a new ask, but we reiterated some of the same asks we had for government around primarily the sector stabilization fund. And we asked that the government actually try and distribute an allocation of that fund when they announced the budget, to show good faith. We also asked for a social enterprise strategy, again, insurance liability protection, and pulling examples from different provinces. Again, we work with different networks, so we're hearing things here and there that help us narrow down our focus and our messaging and making sure we're supporting the sector. And then lastly, making sure that the sector is at the table when we're thinking about recovery and rebuilding. Now that we're in a second phase, what's happening in the next phase? So how making sure that the sector's voice is heard, that the right people are around the table, and that government is listening to the voice of the sector, because it's very much needed. And the sector has been reacting quickly, nimbly, flexibly, and just you know, doing amazing things to be able to support their communities, as Angela demonstrated and as Anjum has explained as well. So we're seeing that happen. So I'm just going to speak to a specific example that happened this month, as I mentioned. So go ahead. So insurance advocacy. So the insurance advocacy we've been doing happens since about the end of May. And so, you know, we've been hearing on the ground, particularly from our sports organizations, that, you know, given that the government opened up after closing down and started to kind of reopen, sports were being impacted, and I think other organizations as well are around that slow reopening were being impacted because around insurance and liability protection. Would anything COVID associated be protected? Is there an issue there? And so the challenge was, yes, there is no protection from that liability, or no exclusion to protect nonprofits. And we know nonprofits, you know, most of the revenues are not coming from government. They're figuring out different ways. We've lost particular pieces of our revenue, which is donations and also events, so fundraising, for example. So how do you mitigate that and mitigate the impacts of what a lack of insurance liability protection would create? And so we advocated for that, and the team was working relentlessly here at ONN to push these things forward. And so I'll break that down in the next slide. Sorry. So, like I said, we heard a lot of, you know, what was happening on the ground around insurance from our network. So we sent a letter to the Attorney General and engaged with the Attorney General's office to address that. And so that did not pan out per se, but we kept going, because there are opportunities there to continue to push that. We sent out an action alert to the sector, so to make the sector more aware of the issue, and maybe they may be some parts of the sector other than sports may be impacted in some way. We really want you to, you know, advocate, engage with your MPPs, send your letters to government, and making sure they're aware that this is a really big issue for the sector. Another opportunity presented itself, which is going to the Standing Committee on Finance and Economic Affairs, since they were doing some studies on the impact of COVID-19 on different sectors, and presenting the insurance liability issue to them. And what we found as well is that it was just not the nonprofit sector that was impacted, it's small business. There's a cross section of sectors that are impacted by this insurance issue. So there was a convergence there. So there's a window of opportunity that presented itself, not only for the nonprofit sector, but other sectors on the ground. And so following that, we sent another letter to the Premier reiterating our asks, which included the insurance liability. And we sent out another network e-blast to get the sector to share those messages, use them in their documents, reiterate them, and move them forward. And finally, the bill was introduced last week, Bill 218, Schedule 1 specifically, around an insurance liability protection for organizations or businesses, but specifically for us, as nonprofits, it's really important because we don't have expendable budgets. We're trying to do good work and support communities in a time of crisis. And so not addressing that would actually put us more at risk. And given what we found in our second survey is that about 1 in 6 or 1 in 5 nonprofits would be closing at the end of the year, obviously we want to remove any other possibilities for that given what's been happening on the ground. So this is kind of how we move through it. And this is kind of the different advocacy activities, from letters to convenings to talking to our network to op-eds to, so just a lot of different activities across the spectrum. And, you know, at each point, just taking advantage of those windows of opportunity that present themselves to be able to push this forward. So right now we're going to be looking at the bill more precisely, and we'll be engaging with government further on to figure out how this will affect the nonprofit sector and in what specific ways it can be helpful as we go forward. So I think just in closing of my presentation, Melanie would want to go to the next slide. I'm sorry, I always forget. I think the key here is just leveraging the opportunities, and the key is to find your place as an organization and figuring out how you engage, work with others in different networks to kind of build the vision you want to see for your communities. And so that's what we try to do at ONN. That's what we've seen different organizations doing across the sector. And so it's been fruitful to see how the sector has, you know, adapted and reacted and continues to work together. One within the nonprofit sector, but also with other organizations and other sectors as well. So I think we have a brilliant window of opportunity. It is a crisis moment, but I think, as Angela said, being humble, working collaboratively and collectively to move these things forward, and just taking the moment as it is right now to build what we'd like to see. So I'll leave it there, and I'm happy to take questions.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Teshini, and thank you to all our speakers today for sharing your insights and your specific examples that people can use in their own work. We do have some questions, so I'd love to use the last 10-15 minutes of this presentation to be able to go over some of them. And if you still have a question for one of our speakers or for all the speakers, please feel free to type in the question box and let us know who you would like if it is for a specific speaker. So I guess to get started, Anjum, we had a pretty specific question for you. So people are really interested in the report that you were talking about. And specifically, one of the things that people are interested in is that how you said you went to expert reviewers. And they were wondering, A, who was approached as an expert reviewer, and how do you choose who's going to be an expert reviewer for something that substantial and important?
This is a great question, and I will say this is our first time doing a report like this, so we were kind of learning as we were going. But coming from a think tank background, you know, we really wanted to make sure what we were putting out there, we had many different eyes looking at it. So we had, I think, close to 20 plus reviewers at the end. So it's a bit of a challenging process with small timelines to put out initial drafts, send it out to reviewers, get everyone's track changes, and somehow integrate it all into one document. And so that's something, the first place that we started was within our YWCA Federation. So we have YWCAs across the country, some people that have advocacy as part of their work, or some people, you know, advocacy is what they do, but it perhaps is not in their job title, it might be at the side of their desk. But we knew that we did not have the expertise because we don't work on the ground. We do more of that advocacy work that is informed by their experiences on the ground. So we went to them first. So we actually do have at our organization a National Advocacy Advisory Committee. So many of the people that were involved with that table we invited, but we also looked at organizations that we have historically worked with. So Teshini talked a lot about coalitions and networks. So for example, we've worked in the past quite a bit with Oxfam. They do a lot of work on the care economy, so we wanted to have them at the table. We also reached out to, for example, Armenia Nazine, who's an economist and has been doing a lot of work on pushing forward you know, the slogan that she's been looking at, the term she's coined, the she session, and the importance of childcare. So we approached Armine, and she was willing to be an expert reviewer. So we were trying to look in the ecosystem, who is starting to do this work. And so, you know, how can we align our messaging? Of course, it was during the summer, so people were already stretched thin during this pandemic. So there's even more people that we could have engaged. But it was such a powerful tool of engagement because people were, you know, had bought into the work and were actively working with us to try to make it as take it to the next level. So it was really important feedback that we got from all of our reviewers. But it was a difficult process in terms of just like the logistics. But in the end, and we're so grateful for it, it made the product much better.
Wonderful. Thank you. That was a really in-depth response, and I think it's really interesting hearing the specific examples of people you reached out to and the thought process behind why you chose them. You maybe hear some typing in the background, responding to some of more of the questions, and so we are going to try to get to as many as possible. But if we don't get to your question today, don't worry. We will be sending a follow-up email that will have more resources and more information. So I wanted to ask two quick questions for you, Angela. So the first one that someone was interested in was about the communities you serve, and they specifically were wondering if communities of faith are included in your work at Roots Community Services, Inc.
Hi, yes. we do, when we talk about the community, we go broad. So we have faith, we have secular, we have youth, we have seniors. We include as many, as broad as categories as we can within there. So, and we do look to each of them because they bring different perspectives, and we usually say the Black, African, and Caribbean because again they have different backgrounds, different ways of looking at things. So we try to make sure we capture all the voices and be inclusive as possible.
That's great. And I guess a follow-up question to that, kind of going back to the communities you work with, we have a question from the audience about how did the region appeals back and work to support the community response table help the sector work better together? Sorry, that was a big mouthful in one question. But just wondering how the work influenced your response and the response together for the sector to work together.
So how the region of Peel brought the group together, is that what they want to know? Am I hearing correctly?
Yeah, so
what
it's,
yeah, well, okay, what I'll say is at the start of the COVID, for this specific one on the anti-Black racism and systemic discrimination, at the start of COVID, the region went out to all of the community organizations and the municipalities and said this is what they're doing and invite people to come to the table. And quite a few people came. I think over 80 organizations were represented. And we were meeting 3 times a week actually to really make sure we get ahead of understand what was happening, get ahead of what was happening. And out of those meetings, we realized there were certain sectors that needed more in-depth work. And we end up having subcommittees formed. So like youth and seniors, and there's one on family violence and men, and this one on systemic discrimination, anti-Black racism and systemic discrimination. So there were a number of subgroups that were formed, and they're still going. And what we've ended up, the main meeting is once a week, and these other committees meet as needed. And on the anti-Black racism and systemic discrimination, there are about 50 organizations or persons representing various organizations, and that is how we form. But the region is very supportive of this, and so we feedback this information into the larger the overall community unit there, and that's how we do that one. So I'm not sure. I hope I answered the question.
Yes, you did. They did
Okay.
respond saying that was exactly what they were meaning.
Yeah.
So that's
Okay.
they were able to understand and then address it. So I wanted to ask one question for Teshini, and then I had a question to kind of finish on that's for all 3 of you. So for Teshini specifically, you had brought up the insurance advocacy challenge and success in your presentation, and our audience was wondering what the response or reception has been from elected officials from the work that ONN and the sector did through this advocacy work.
I think overall the response has been positive. We've engaged with many different elected officials in different ways. We've had some roundtables with, say, for example, our policy committee and provincial associations consistently with different ministers' offices. So I think they're really seeing the value of the sector as we go forward, and we're pushing these asks forward, and the solutions. I think one marker of success also is from the standing committee presentation that was done in August, and some of the proposals we had put forward, that was marked down and recorded. And so I think that signals that there is incredible interest in what the sector does have to offer in terms of the work that the sector does. And so with the insurance advocacy, it's a really great step to support the sector in the way that it needs, because this is a very much a challenging time for the sector. But I think going forward, it's how do we get the government to really see the sector as that space and that entity doing all this work across different subsectors as well, and being able to support and react to that in a way that's really positive over the long term. So we're happy with what's been slowly happening, but I think we really want to see going forward, that the government really give us that stabilization fund that we need to be able to support organizations like Angela's and like the YWCA's that Anjum is engaged with, right? So I think, and also different organizations. So I think that's the critical point, but these are signals these are positive signals that we're getting for the sector. But so how do we leverage those positive opportunities to create more opportunity that pushes us forward? Hope that answers the question.
Yes, it did. It did. So, and I guess it's also a nice segue to the final question that I wanted to ask for all three of you today, which is from one of our audience members. So first, they wanted to give positive feedback. They really appreciate each of your presentations. So thank you so much for joining us today and sharing them. But they also wanted to know if you guys had any tips on working with sector stakeholders and partners who frankly are really overwhelmed with work to ensure that, so how do you ensure that everyone's capacity and priorities are respected while also trying to move forward and lead change?
Okay, I'll go. Self-care is very important. That's a mantra we have. Well, within our organization, I ask staff to please to work flexible hours, to work according to their needs. And because what has happened is a lot of our clients have been asking to meet later in the day, especially those with children or so. They've been asking for more flexible time because everybody's working from home. So I've asked myself, please schedule your time accordingly. Do not overdo. And so what I've done actually now is that I've just implemented, and I borrowed this from another colleague, giving them a day of gratitude where they do not open their laptops. They do not do any work. So they're getting a day of gratitude at least once a month that they can just take that day, do nothing. But it is a lot of work. It is the work has increased, but we need to be able to say when it's enough and take that time out. So I don't hold them to say they must be at work 9 to 5 or whatever, but let them schedule their time that is best for them.
That's very interesting. I think the flexibility can help people avoid burnout while also still getting everything that you want achieved. Anjum, did you want to go next?
Sure, yes. This is such a great question. And I think it's figuring out for your organization, but also the other organizations you're approaching, what is the role that you see? So I'll say for the YWCA, we work broadly speaking on gender equity, but we have specific policy priorities around housing and homelessness through a gender lens, childcare, economic justice, or labor market access for women, and two-spirit and gender diverse people. And we also do, oh gosh, I feel like I'm missing the last one. Oh yes, a big piece of the work also is around addressing gender-based violence. So these are some of our key policy priorities. Within gender-based violence, the lead agency at the national level has been Women's Shelters Canada. So we sit on their table and we help inform, but they have been really taking that leadership role, and we're contributing what we can, which is amplifying, ensuring that we leverage our pan-Canadian perspective because we have YWCAs across the country, making sure that regional diversity lens is there. But they're taking a leadership role and we're there as a support. We've been taking a leadership role right now at the national level around the task force and the action plan on women and the economy. And so we've been, approaching partners with, can you amplify this? This is how you can take part. Here are some of the common messaging we've started to develop. Can you amplify? So it's kind of being very clear about where are you the lead and where are you asking people to amplify? Because that might help people figure out where they can position, where they fit in that work. And I think about the tool that Teshini shared, that will look different for each of the different topics that you work on. And then I guess the last piece is within our YWCAs, with the Feminist Economic Recovery Plan, when we launched it, we also created an amplification package. So, making it very easy. Here are their tweets. Here are the graphics, and just, giving people everything they need and making it as easy as possible to engage. And even we've started to create op-ed templates, for example. So, we say do media advocacy, but here's a starting point. So I think that could help people who care about the work but it's just kind of figuring out how do they tap in, and that might create the pathway for them to do so.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
That's a
and
really important point.
sorry, Melanie. Go ahead.
No, you go ahead, Teshini. I'd love to hear your thoughts as to kind of help wrap up the webinar today.
Yeah, so I agree with what Anjum said and both with what Angela said. So internally in your organization, how are you offering flexibility? At ONN, we are a decent work employer, and so we try to make sure we offer a flexible schedule. If people need to take a break, that's something that they can do. So trying to kind of create that space for that. And also on the external side, or working with our partners and our networks, like Anjum said, providing templates, making it easy to share information. Also being flexible yourself, like yes, some may not be able to attend a meeting or respond, so always leaving the option open for, hey, send us an email anytime you have a question, or share what you can share with us. If you need something to be amplified, share it with us, we'll try and amplify it in our networks. So always just kind of sharing, checking in where we can, and offering flexibility and space, because I think with the pandemic, everybody's time has been kind of super focused on trying to get government to take action in the way that we need. And so sometimes we love our passion, but we have to take a step back to breathe, to reflect, and to go forward. So even at ONN, there was a process, I think 4 months in, we did take a step back to be like, okay, what are we doing now? How are we thinking about the next steps? What's recovery? What have we seen so far? So take that opportunity as an organization to take that pause to reflect, to see how you're doing, and where kind of the key opportunities are for you going forward, and how you want to react, and how you want to move, and how you want to support, and how you want to amplify in the different spaces and with the different partners that you're working with. So I think that's really key. But I have to jump off because I have another meeting. Thank you so much for having me here, and it was great being on this webinar with both Angela and Anjum. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, and thank you so much to all of our speakers today, Angela, Anjum, and Teshini, and thank you to everyone who joined. It was a great discussion, and we look forward to furthering the conversation. We'll send you a follow-up email with the resources, and if you have any questions, always feel free to connect with us. We hope to see you at future events like Nonprofit Driven or future webinars, so we can keep the advocacy work and the great change our sector is making across the sector going. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.